Welcome to your online lecture for Chapter 7, Israel's Sacred Songs, in which we'll cover the Book of Psalms, Song of Songs, and the Book of Lamentations. The three books that we'll be covering in this chapter belong to the third section of the Tanakh. Remember the Tanakh, the T referring to the Torah, the N, the Nevi'im referring to the prophets, and the K, the Ketuvim referring to the writings. In this section called the writings, there are several types of literature: songs, wisdom literature, short stories, historical narrative, and apocalyptic literature. The Book of Psalms. The Book of Psalms is a collection of 150 poems most addressed to God. Thomas Merton, a Christian mystic, called them the most significant and influential collection of religious poems ever written. The Psalms are the substance of daily worship in Jewish and Christian practices to this day. Considering the literary world of the Book of Psalms, 20th century interpreters have recognized several different literary categories based on the Psalms' form and content. The first type are Psalms of Lament. These are prayers to God that describe a situation of distress, crying out to God in anguish, and calling upon God to act. There are personal laments as well as communal laments. There are psalms that are songs of praise. These are poems that acknowledge and affirm God in terms of either who God is or what God has done. Some of this type give thanks to God for specific deeds of deliverance. These are songs of thanksgiving. Then there are other types of psalms, namely instructional psalms, reflections on human morality, reflections on the suffering of the righteous, wisdom songs, royal songs, liturgical psalms, Zion psalms, and acrostic psalms. Finally, there are also psalms that defy any category, for example, Psalm 8. Take a moment now to read Psalm 8 and look for any features, literary as well as theological. In one of your discussion questions, you'll be studying a psalm and looking at its relational world. What does Howard and Young mean by that? Well, each psalm focuses on one of the following basic relationships: God and I or myself, God and other divine beings, God and Israel, and God and nature. This is what's meant by the relational world. When we look at the historical context of the Psalms, there is no doubt that many, if not all of the Psalms, were associated with acts of worship in ancient Israel. The titles give instructions for their use in the worship itself, for example, Psalm 4 and 5. The word Salah, which you'll see in the Psalms, is notation concerning performance, although we're not exactly sure what it means. Some psalms reflect a specific liturgical event or worship event. For example, enthronement psalms, which are sung during or said during the enthronement of the Lord festivals. As well, rabbinic literature records the use of a number of psalms in the worship of the Second Temple. And so it's no doubt that many of them are used in worship, even today. Although there is little clear evidence as to particulars, we can assume that most psalms originated as songs associated with corporate worship, and so we can see them as a product of the life of the community as much as the work of individual poets. You can think of a contemporary hymn book and think about the variety of backgrounds and contexts out of which the songs emerge, and communities or even individuals that would have written the songs. In a way, the Psalms are the hymn book of the ancient Jews. Dating particular psalms has proven to be futile because of the lack of external evidence and the ambiguity in their imagery. It's kind of like trying to date the songs and music that we have now. For some, it might have some dead giveaways, and for others, it may be eternal. With respect to authorship, David is considered to be the traditional author of the Psalms, but there is little evidence of that. Some psalms are attributed to other famous persons, such as Moses and Solomon. So it is likely that the psalms were composed throughout the biblical period, certainly from the time of David and Solomon onward. Take a moment now to work on your discussion question. Select any psalm you wish from the Book of Psalms and describe the type or genre of that psalm. Talk about how you know it is that type. Describe the structure of the psalm. Are there any forms of parallelism? Describe the imagery used in the psalm, and finally, describe the relational world of the psalm. The Megillot, The five Megillot, or the five festival scrolls, are works among the writings, the Ketuvim. They are Ruth, the Song of Songs, Ecclesiastes, Lamentations, and Esther. The custom developed of reading one of these scrolls on each of the five important festivals: Esther during the festival of Purim, Lamentations during the fast of the 9th of Ab, the anniversary of the tragedy of the destruction of the temple, Song of Songs during Passover, Ruth during Shavuot, and Ecclesiastes during Sukkot. As Jesus was growing up, he would have heard the same scrolls and readings and writings being read in the synagogue year after year. For Christians, this is no different. During Christmas, we hear the nativity narratives, and during Easter, we hear of the resurrection narratives. Among the festival scrolls is the Song of Songs, also known as the Song of Solomon or Canticles, which is a collection of erotic love poetry. Many have interpreted the poem allegorically since rabbinic times. For Jewish interpreters, the Lord's relationship with his bride Israel is what is allegorical here. For Christian interpreters, it's the love between Christ and his church. Despite their common interest in erotic love, they are diverse in subject matter, tone, and situation. I invite you to take some time now to read through, or leaf through at least, the Song of Songs. Notice the language, the imagery, the metaphor, the allegory being used there, and the eroticism that's inherent in the language. The poems in the Song of Songs are lyric, in the sense that they are subjective expressions of the feelings of a speaker addressed to a particular listener. In love monologues, an I speaks either to or about his or her beloved. In love monologue, there is a conversation between two lovers. The poems in the Song of Songs are lyric, in the sense that they are subjective expressions of the feelings of a speaker addressed to a particular listener. In love monologues, an I speaks either to or about his or her beloved. In love monologue, there is a conversation between two lovers. Several of the poems in the Song of Songs are known as wasfs. These are poems or sections of a poem that describe the parts of the human body through a series of metaphors. Take time to look at chapter 4, verses 1 to 5. Notice the description of a woman from her eyes down to her breasts using agricultural imagery. It's likely that the Song of Songs is simply a group of love songs gathered together without any overarching pattern of organization. In these poems, male and female speakers voice freely their affection and desire for one another, but never lurid expressions of erotic love. As a whole, the poems are a celebration of the love a man feels for a woman and vice versa. This is in keeping with the understanding of sexuality in both creation narratives. In terms of the historical context of the Song of Songs, although the first verse identifies the work as Solomon's, it's unlikely that Solomon is the author. See page 157 in your textbook for more on that. Given the variety of poetry, it may be more appropriate to speak of an editor or a collector. There are no convincing reconstructions of the original setting of the Song of Songs. There is no evidence within the text to interpret it, however, allegorically either. In fact, throughout the centuries, many Christian interpreters have failed in completing commentaries on the Song of Songs. This is precisely because the allegorical reading of the Song of Songs can be very difficult. And so we come to our next discussion question, where I invite you to consider the Song of Songs as allegory or not. Prove to me that the Song of Songs is intended to be one or the other. And now we turn to the Book of Lamentations. Lamentations is a collection of 5 poems mourning the destruction of Jerusalem. It was originally composed after Jerusalem was sacked and the temple destroyed by the Babylonians in 587 BCE. Within the Jewish liturgical calendar, the book is traditionally recited on the fast day, the 9th of Av, mourning the destruction of both the first and the second temples. The Second Temple would have been begun roughly 50 or more years before the birth of Jesus. When we look at the literary world of the Book of Lamentations, we notice that the first 4 poems are acrostics. There are 22 stanzas for each letter of the Hebrew alphabet. The acrostic pattern is common in the Hebrew Bible, for example, Psalm 119 and elsewhere. The acrostic pattern was likely a device to assist in memorization. It also creates a sense of thoroughness, in other words, covering everything from A to Z. The poems in chapters 1, 2, and 4 use a kinah rhythm associated with funeral dirges, where the first line receives 3 beats and the second receives 2. For ancient hearers, once you hear this rhythm, it quickly comes to mind funeral songs. The poems are not only vivid descriptions of the horrors of the total destruction of Jerusalem, but they step back and reflect on the meaning of the event. Jerusalem, or Mount Zion, was the symbol of the Lord's presence with the covenant people. It was the symbolic center of ancient Israel. This expression of grieving involves trying to place the loss in some framework that makes sense out of it. In other words, Jerusalem and its inhabitants were being punished by the Lord for their disobedience. Speakers also urge survivors to cry out in anguish to the Lord for allowing this to happen, and the collection ends with an impassioned plea to the Lord to remember. At the center of the anthology, chapter 3, the basic tension is made apparent. It is between the presumed anger of the Lord and a stubborn faith that God is merciful. I invite you to take a moment now to read this chapter. It is beautiful poetry that expresses deep anguish and cries of distress. Despite this general hope, there is no anticipation that circumstances will soon change, as many of the laments of the Psalms also articulate. Regarding the historical context of the world of Lamentations, there's biblical evidence of acts of lamentations. For example, in Zechariah chapter 7, which were written about 518 BCE. This suggests that a fast had been held ever since the city fell. Your final discussion question asks, what value is there in a lament, and perhaps the rituals associated with it, either personal or communal laments? What value is there?